Life is actually a beautiful thing. Just think back to your childhood for a moment. Those carefree, worry-free days, the summer vacations, the times you spent playing games in the streets without a single care in the world until it got dark. Then think about your first love, the first movie you ever watched in a theater, your first real vacation, and all those precious moments spent with your family. Like I said, life is beautiful, really, but it feels like it all passes by in the blink of an eye. And then, before you know it, it arrives. Death. In this vast ocean of possibilities we call life, it's the only absolute certainty. Now, it happens in many different ways. Everyone dies for a different reason, an accident, an illness. But one way or another, we are all going to face that moment. And even though we try to stay busy just to avoid thinking about it, deep down, there's a question that lingers in the back of all our minds. What exactly happens in that moment? At the moment of death, being conscious 1 second and then suddenly sinking into darkness without feeling a thing, what does a person actually feel while they're dying? What do they think? Or do they think at all? What's going on inside our brains at that exact point? These are incredibly deep questions. But the truth is, we have a much clearer picture now than we ever did before. We're starting to understand what goes on behind the scenes, and believe me, it's a much different experience than what you might imagine. Most of the time, people don't show much of an outward reaction when they pass away. Because of this, we naturally assume that the experience is like falling into a deep sleep. But scientific experiments are telling us a completely different story. Back in 2013, researchers at the University of Michigan conducted a study with lab rats. And as you might guess, they measured their brain activity during the dying process. What they found was quite strange. After a cardiac arrest, even when there was no heartbeat and no breathing, low-level gamma waves were observed throughout their entire brains. But what was even weirder was that these waves were more synchronized than when the rats were actually alive and healthy. And here's the most interesting part. This type of brain activity is exactly what we see in humans during a state of conscious perception. You know, like when you see something and you consciously process it, interpret it, or understand it. So, while the rats weren't breathing and their hearts weren't even beating, their brains were reaching a level of conscious perception. Strange, right? Yeah, actually, it's beyond strange. Because this finding completely contradicted the old assumption that the brain shuts down entirely during death. It wasn't an unconscious drift, quite the opposite. Right before consciousness fully cuts out, there appears to be a burst of brain activity even higher than when we're awake. Scientists believe this final flash might actually be a reflection of our evolutionary history, even in the moments where the chance of survival is at its absolute lowest. Instead of cutting back on energy, the brain actually cranks it up. Maybe this is the organism's last-ditch effort to mobilize every single mental resource it has left, hoping for a way out. Even on the edge of death, the brain is still investing in the possibility of maintaining life. Naturally, these results brought up even more questions. I mean, humans have much larger and more complex brains than rats. So does that change things for us? To find out, a very interesting experiment was conducted at Imperial College London in 2018. They wanted to look for similarities between two events that seemed totally unrelated on the surface. The first was what we call near-death experiences, or NDEs. Researchers focused on the hallucinations reported by people who were brought back to life after clinical death. About 20% of these people talk about these types of experiences. The white light, the tunnel, all of that. On the other side of the study, they looked at hallucinations caused by a very powerful psychedelic known as DMT. They wanted to see if there was a link. First, they gave volunteers a specific dose of DMT. After taking it, those subjects naturally transitioned into a different dimension for a while. When they saw the results, they were literally shocked. The similarities were immense. Both the people who returned from death and those under the influence of the drug talked about the same things, transcending time and space and feeling one with the people and objects around them. In other words, in the moment of death, the brain behaves as if it's under the influence of an incredibly potent hallucinogen. Chris Timmerman, who led this study, makes some fascinating points. According to him, we actually experience mini-deaths from time to time while we're still living. It doesn't necessarily have to be triggered by a drug. What he's talking about is an instantaneous surge in the brain's electrochemical activity. And the areas where this activity is most intense are the middle temporal lobes, the regions of the brain associated with memory, dreaming, and even learning. There's another wild finding. Near the moment of death, we see unusual activity in the brain's time perception centers. This explains why so many people say their entire life flashed before their eyes like a movie. The flow of time literally bends, intensifies, or feels like it stops completely in those moments. Perhaps that's why a single second of brain activity can be subjectively experienced as an entire lifetime. In a sense, our brain is running its own final simulation. According to Timmerman, the real difficulty isn't the experience itself, but putting it into words. People who have had these experiences try to describe them, but it's as if language isn't enough to express what happened. This suggests there might be so much more going on that they simply can't convey to us. So, what's the solution? Better imaging. In some labs, researchers are already predicting what movie someone is watching just by observing their brain activity. Timmerman believes that in the future, we might be able to directly visualize what's happening. But there are some other aspects of this topic we haven't touched on yet, specifically the issue of pain. Both near-death survivors and the subjects in these studies say these experiences are, strangely enough, painless. And there's another finding that suggests our senses shut down in a very specific order as we die. First, we lose the feeling of hunger and thirst, then the ability to speak and see. But the very last things to go, hearing and touch. This means that in their final moments, a person can likely still feel your touch and hear the sound of your voice. So, what are we supposed to take away from all this? Death? Yeah. It's not exactly a pleasant thought. And because it's so hard to go about our lives thinking about this ultimate end every second, we usually avoid it. We're afraid. But we've talked about the meaning of death before. Why we shouldn't live forever. How we must one day leave this world to make room, resources, and a story for the next generations. But these findings tell us something important. Death is not the nothingness people think it is. It's more like a final storm the brain creates within itself, a kind of farewell symphony. It's a transition filled with light. Knowing this adds a touch of human warmth to the mystery. Knowing about the end reveals the value of the journey. So, maybe the truest sentence is the simplest one. While you're living, you really need to live.